And on top of it was, read me. So one of the readings I asked you to look at came from this book, A New Kind of Christianity, 10 Questions That Are Transforming the Faith by Brian McLaren. And that's the chapter 8 that you had, which really asks us to look at the Bible perhaps in a different way. He will suggest that basically a lot of people look at the Bible like this: we the people, the Constitution. And what's the value of the Constitution?
It's a unifying document.
It's a unifying document. It is authoritative, correct?
Yes.
But it still needs, even the Constitution needs interpretation, because that's why we have the Supreme Court. And so things that we think were obvious are not always that obvious. But the problem with the Constitution is that it's used to say yes or no. It's used to say, according to Article 3, Section 4, you can't do this. Or according to Article 7, Section 1, sorry, you as a president, you're not supposed to take gifts from outside of the nation, a monument. And so how does that get lived out in the Bible? If the Bible's a constitution, what do people use it for? Yep. A legalistic document is very black and white, and it becomes a source for proof texting. And virtually any position, I think, can be proof text from the Bible. In our own history as a nation, we need to remember that it wasn't that long ago that the Bible was read and interpreted as supporting slavery. And so I think it's important for us to realize that you can find just about anything you want in the Bible if you're looking for a proof text. So there's another alternative. He wants to suggest that the library is a communal library, that the Bible is a communal library. And so I think what's really neat about that is what's in a library? All different kinds of books and literature, right? And we have whole sections, if you go to the Bozeman Library, poetry, science fiction, history. And so if you look at the 66 books of the Bible as a communal library, you don't read poetry the same way you read narrative, do you? You don't read narrative the same way you would read a proverb, for instance, wisdom literature. And so I think that's the value, is that it allows the Holy Scriptures to be for us a source of many different kinds of literature. And not every kind of literature necessarily is narrative. And there, if you look at the story of Jonah, which is one of my favorite stories in the Bible, the question always is, did this happen? Did Jonah get swallowed by a whale and 3 days later gets vomited up? Undigested Jonah was all the whale could take? And if you look at it as a library, you say, well, wait a second, there's a category called short stories. And a short story, or a parable for that matter, doesn't necessarily have to be historically correct. But what it teaches flows through those words and makes a difference in our lives. And so I would like to support the whole idea. He offers a third option, and he calls it an inspired communal library, which says to us that still the Word of God is in this book. And it's important for us to see it that way. But it still is a library of assorted books and different flavors. I mean, women who have diamonds, how brilliant would your diamond be if it had just one facet? Kind of boring. The more facets, the more light gets reflected, the more brilliant the diamond is. And so I think the same thing is true for scriptures. And so when we start looking today now at the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew is not the same facet that Mark or Luke or John are. They have different audiences, they have different understandings, and I think, again, they don't always agree with one another. Now, for the conservative, that drives them up a wall because they don't know what to do with those inconsistencies, they call it. And so McLaren in chapter 9, which you didn't get, says there are three ways for us to read the Bible. We can read the Bible that conservatives or literalists want us to read it, and that means being under the text. The text is above us, and we have to succumb or have to subordinate ourselves to the text. Liberals, in some ways, look at it the other way. They're above the text, that they have abilities to understand and to discern and to reject even parts of the scriptures that maybe they don't feel is appropriate any longer. McLaren would argue, and I would argue as well, that what we need to do, and what I think Webbs does a great job with, is being in the text, allowing you to be in those words. And in some senses, McLaren would argue, revelation, learning, comes from a dialogue that we have with the text and with each other when we allow Scripture to speak to us. And so that's what I hope we can do today. So, the Gospel of Matthew. So, how do we get to the Gospel of Matthew? We need to remember that 400 years have now passed from the closing of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Hebrew canon, to the time of Matthew. So it's a significant amount of time. And we've seen transitions in world authority. The last one under the Old Testament especially was Persia, which allowed, it said King Cyrus of Persia, for the people of Israel to leave the Babylonian exile and come back to Jerusalem. After Persia ceased to be a world power, it was the Greeks that took charge. And they lasted for about 75 to 100 years, but then the Romans came in. And this is the time of the New Testament. When Jesus walked on this earth, the Romans had already been in charge of Israel for 100 years. And so it wasn't like they moved in yesterday. They've been there a long time. They've been an occupying nation. And there are many who believe that it would never end. The Romans are going to be there forever. I think Rome felt that way especially. So we have this first gospel, the gospel according to Matthew. And it's important for us to look at some words. So the word gospel comes from euangelion, which is Greek, made up of two different words. A-U, meaning good, as if in a eulogy. Usually a eulogy is good words about somebody who has died. And we get the word angel out of the next word. Angelion means message. So literally, the gospel means it is a good message that we need to hear. And so I think some people read the Bible. I want us, I hope, in this study, to hear the Bible, to allow it to be heard. And so sometimes, I don't know about you and your own personal devotions, but there are times when I will read the Bible out loud to myself, simply so that I get more than my brain involved. I get my ears involved. And I think as you hear the Bible, we'll find out that there are different ways of hearing it. So guess who this is?
Matthew.
Matthew, holding a gospel book, right? A writer. What do you know about Matthew? Tax collector, yes. We're told in chapter 9 exactly who he was. He was a tax collector that Jesus asked to be one of his followers. And I don't think we fully understand how much tax collectors were hated. Because Matthew was a Jew, but he was working for the Roman government. And so not only was he considered an apostate in some ways, and in fact, tax collectors were not allowed to enter the temple. They were unclean, okay? But he was also seen as a political ally of the Romans, and therefore he was not very popular. So to have Jesus go to one who would be an outcast in almost any Jewish circle and say, I want you to be my follower, must have been controversial at the least, okay? So Matthew is a Jew, and who is he writing to? he's writing to a Jewish community. And we'll get into this a little bit further after the videos I'm going to show you. But in some ways, Matthew's gospel is written, one, to prove, and that's why there's so much Old Testament quoting in Matthew's gospel, that Jesus is the promised Messiah. But his second point is equally as important. And Israel, this Messiah invited you to be a part of the kingdom of God, and you rejected it. And so there's that double fork about he is who he was, but you didn't accept him for who he was. So, 2 short videos, about 7 minutes each. I'm glad Valerie watched them. This is from the Bible Project, and so if you just search the web, thebibleproject.com or org, their whole intent is, it's kind of in a cartoon style, but they're trying to explain the whole Bible to make it understandable, especially, I think, to high school students. But, if most of us find it also, that's kind of where we are sometimes in our knowledge of the Bible. And so I'm going to show these 2 to you. I'm going to show you the first one. I'm going to stop and ask if you have any questions or any comments about it. It covers the first half of the Bible, of Matthew rather, and then we'll look at the second one.
The Gospel according to Matthew. It's one of the earliest official accounts about Jesus of Nazareth, his life, his death, and his resurrection. The book itself is anonymous, but the earliest reliable tradition links it to Matthew the tax collector, who was one of the 12 apostles that Jesus appointed, and he actually appears within the book itself. For about 30 to 40 years, the apostles orally taught and passed on their eyewitness accounts about Jesus, along with his teachings that they had all memorized. And Matthew has then collected and arranged all of these into this amazing tapestry and designed the book to highlight certain themes about Jesus. In this video, we're just going to cover the first half of the book. Specifically, Matthew wants to show how Jesus is the continuation and fulfillment of the whole biblical story about God and Israel. That Jesus is the Messiah from the line of David, that he is a new authoritative teacher like Moses, and not only that, Jesus is God with us, or in Hebrew, Emmanuel. And Matthew designed this book with an introduction and then a conclusion, and these act like a frame around 5 clear sections right here in the center, each of which concludes with a long block of Jesus' teaching. Now this design is very intentional and it's amazing. Just watch how this works. Chapters 1 through 3, they set the stage by attaching Jesus' story right onto the storyline of the Old Testament scriptures. So Matthew opens with a genealogy about Jesus, that highlights how he is from the messianic line of the son of David, and he's a son of Abraham. That means he's going to bring God's blessing to all of the nations. After that, we get the famous story about Jesus' birth and how all of the events fulfilled the Old Testament prophetic promises, that the nations would come and honor the Messiah, that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, but even more than that, Jesus' conception by the Holy Spirit, his name Emmanuel, all of these work together to show that Jesus is no mere human. He is God with us, God become human. So you can see 2 of Matthew's key themes right here in the introduction. He's from the line of David, he's Emmanuel. But Matthew also wants to show how Jesus is a new Moses. So like Moses, Jesus came up out of Egypt, he passed through the waters of baptism, and he entered into the wilderness for 40 days. And then Jesus goes up onto a mountain to deliver his new teaching. So through all of this, Matthew is claiming that Jesus is the promised greater than Moses figure, who's going to deliver Israel from slavery, he's going to give them new divine teaching, he's going to save them from their sins, and bring about a new covenant relationship between God and his people. This Moses and Jesus parallel also explains why Matthew has structured the center of the book the way that he did. These 5 main parts highlight Jesus as a teacher, and he's created a parallel. Jesus as a teacher parallels the 5 books of Moses. Jesus is the new authoritative covenant teacher who's going to fulfill the storyline of the Torah. Now in the first section, chapters 4 to 7, Jesus steps onto the scene announcing the arrival of God's kingdom. And this is really key. The kingdom is in essence about God's rescue operation for his whole world, and it's taking place through King Jesus. Jesus has come to confront evil, especially spiritual evil, and its whole legacy of demon oppression and disease and death. Jesus has come to restore God's rule and reign over the whole world, by creating a new family of people who will follow him, obey his teachings, and live under his rule. So, after Jesus begins healing people and forming a movement, a community, he takes his followers out to a mountain or a hillside, and he delivers his first big block of teaching, traditionally called the Sermon on the Mount. And here Jesus explores what it looks like to follow him and live in God's kingdom. And it's an upside-down kingdom where there are no privileged members. So the poor, the nobodies, the wealthy, the religious, everybody is invited and is called to turn, to repent, and to follow Jesus and join his family. Jesus says that he's not here to set aside the commands of the Torah or the Old Testament. Rather, he's here to fulfill all of that through his life, through his teachings. He's here to transform the hearts of his people so that they can truly love God and love their neighbor, including their enemy. After concluding his great teaching on the kingdom, the next section shows Jesus bringing the kingdom into reality in the day-to-day lives of people. So Matthew's arranged here 9 stories about Jesus bringing the power of God's kingdom into the lives of hurting, broken people. There are 3 groups of 3 stories, and they're all about people who are sick or have broken bodies or they're in danger, and Jesus heals or saves them by these acts of grace and power. And then right in between these triads, we find 2 parallel stories about Jesus' call that people should follow him. Matthew's making a point here. One can only experience the power of Jesus' grace by following him and becoming his disciple. Now, after Matthew has shown the power of the kingdom through Jesus, Jesus then extends his reach by sending out the 12 disciples who are going to go do what he's been doing. And this leads to the second large block of teaching, chapter 10. And here, Jesus teaches his disciples how to announce the kingdom and what to expect once they did. Many among Israel are accepting Jesus and his offer of the kingdom, but Israel's leaders, they aren't. They stand to lose a lot if they repent and become disciples of Jesus. And so Jesus knows they're going to reject him and persecute his followers, which is exactly what happens. In the next section, chapters 11 through 13, Matthew has collected a group of stories about how people are responding to Jesus and his message, and it's a mixed bag. So some stories are positive. People love Jesus and they think he's the Messiah. Others are more neutral, like John the Baptist, or even the members of Jesus' own family. And they make it clear that Jesus is not what they expected. And then you have Israel's leaders. They're entirely negative. You have the Pharisees and the Bible scholars. They all reject Jesus together. They think he's a false teacher. He's leading the people astray. They think he's blasphemous in these exalted claims he's making about himself. But Jesus isn't surprised or thrown by all these diverse responses. In fact, he focuses on it in the third block of teaching, chapter 13. Here, Matthew's collected together a bunch of Jesus' parables about the kingdom, like about a farmer throwing seed on 4 types of soil, or about a mustard seed, or a pearl or buried treasure. These parables are like a commentary on the stories that you just read in chapters 11 and 12. Some people are accepting Jesus with enthusiasm. Others are rejecting him. But God's kingdom is of ultimate value, and it will not stop spreading despite all of these obstacles. So, that's the first half of the Gospel of Matthew. Now, here's a few more things to look for as you read through these chapters. Matthew's presented Jesus, remember, as the continuation and fulfillment of the Old Testament storyline. So, look for how he weaves in quotations from the Old Testament scriptures. And what you'll find is that they're placed at strategic points in the story, explaining more about Jesus and his identity. So stop, take time to go look up these references and read them in their Old Testament context. And most often you'll discover really cool, interesting connections. Lastly, pay attention to the types of people who accept Jesus and follow him. And you'll see that it's most often people who are unimportant, they're nobodies, or they're irreligious. And these are the people who are transformed by their trust or faith in Jesus and follow him. And it's the religious and the prideful who are offended by him. So how is this tension between Jesus and Israel's leaders going to play itself out? That's what the second half of Matthew is all about.
So what struck you from that?
He's a good artist. Sorry, no.
Pardon?
It's an excellent summary.
It's a great, I mean, I could not give you a better summary, so I thought, why try? But I think it's interesting that already we see set up in this that in some ways Matthew wants Jesus to be seen as the new Moses. Right? And so there are 5 main teaching sections, and we'll get to that in a minute. And each of them, in some ways, is supposed to remind you that there are 5 books in the Torah. So as Moses gave us, in tradition anyway, the first 5 books of the Bible called the Torah, now Jesus also gives 5 new teachings. And they actually are supposed to supersede, be more authoritative than what Moses said. Kathy, you had a question?
Oh, no.
Oh, okay.
Scratching my ears?
Yes.
This morning, I was just reading the Jewish annotated New Testament, and she talks a lot about the Moses connection, which I probably not paying enough attention to, and it was just really, really interesting about things that brought getting to that.
Well, what's interesting is that this view is looking at, and we'll get to that after the second video, is that there's 2 halves to the book. Other exegetes, scholars of the New Testament, want to really say there are 5 teachings, and everything else centers around those 5 teachings. And so I think a compromise today is saying that there's the central part of the book, but they're not the whole book. The book has these 2 halves. So the first half really has helped us focus primarily on Jesus' ministry in Galilee. And now we'll look at the second half.
The Gospel according to Matthew. In the first video, we saw how Matthew introduced Jesus as the Messiah from the line of David, and as a new authoritative teacher like Moses, and also as Emmanuel, which in Hebrew means God with us. After Jesus announced and taught about the arrival of God's kingdom, and after he brought the kingdom into day-to-day life among the people of Israel, we saw that Jesus was accepted by many, but rejected by others, especially Israel's religious leaders, the Pharisees. And so the big question is, how is this conflict between Jesus and Israel's leaders going to play itself out? The next large section, chapters 14 through 20, explore all the different expectations people have about the Messiah. So Jesus keeps healing sick people, and twice he even miraculously provides food for these huge crowds in the desert. One is made up of Jewish people, and the other is a non-Jewish crowd. And this sign is very similar to what Moses did for Israel in the wilderness. And so all these people are excited about Jesus. They think he's the great prophet and the Messiah, but not the religious leaders. Their view of the Messiah is built on passages like Psalm 2 or Daniel chapter 2 about a victorious Messiah who's going to deliver Israel and defeat the pagan oppressors. And from their point of view, Jesus, he's a false teacher. He's making blasphemous claims about himself. And so there are stories here about them increasing their opposition, hatching a plan to kill him. And so in response, Jesus, he withdraws. And he begins teaching his closest disciples what it means for him to be Israel's Messiah, because it is not what anybody expects. So Jesus asks his disciples, chapter 16, he says, "Who do you all say that I am?" And Peter comes up with the right answer, it seems. He says, "Well, you're the Messiah. You're the Son of the living God." But then it becomes clear that Peter's thinking about a king who's going to reign victoriously through military power. And Jesus challenges Peter, saying that, yes, I am going to become king, but through a different way. And so Jesus starts to teach on themes from the prophet Isaiah, who said that the Messianic king would suffer and die for the sins of his own people. And so Jesus, he was positioning himself as a Messianic king who reigns by becoming a servant, and who would lay down his life for Israel and the nations. Well, Peter and the disciples, they mostly just don't get it. And so Jesus enters into the 4th block of teaching, followed by a series of teachings after that. And these are all about the upside-down nature of Jesus' Messianic kingdom, which turns upside down all of our value systems. So in the community of the servant king, you gain honor by serving others. And instead of getting revenge, you forgive and do good to your enemies. And in Jesus' kingdom, you gain true wealth by giving your wealth away to the poor. To follow the servant Messiah, you must become a servant yourself. In the next section, we watch the 2 kingdoms clash, Jesus' kingdom and that of Israel's leader. Jesus comes to Jerusalem for Passover riding in on a donkey, and the crowds are hailing him as the Messiah. And Jesus immediately marches into the courtyard of the temple, and he creates this huge disruption that brings the daily sacrifices to a halt. His actions speak louder than words here. As Israel's king, Jesus was asserting his royal authority over the temple, the place where God and Israel met together. And in Jesus' view, the temple was compromised by the hypocrisy of Israel's leaders. And so here he's challenging their authority, and naturally, they're deeply offended. And so they try to trap Jesus and shame him in public debate, and they fail. So they end up just determining to have him killed. In response, Jesus delivers his final block of teaching. He first offers this passionate critique of the Pharisees and their hypocrisy. And then he weeps over Jerusalem and its rejection of God and his kingdom. Then Jesus withdraws with the disciples, and he starts telling them what's going to happen. He's going to be executed by these leaders. But in doing so, they're going to create their own demise. Because instead of accepting Jesus' way of the peaceful kingdom, they're going to take the road of revolt against Rome, and so Jerusalem and its temple are going to be destroyed. But, Jesus says, that is not the end of the story. He's going to be vindicated after his death by his resurrection. And one day, he'll return and set up his kingdom over all nations. And so in the meanwhile, the disciples need to stay alert and stay committed to just announcing Jesus and his kingdom and spreading the good news. And so with all of that ringing in the disciples' ears, the story comes to its climax. That night, Jesus takes the disciples aside and he celebrates a Passover meal with them. The Passover retells the story of Israel's rescue from slavery through the death of the Passover lamb. And then Jesus takes the bread and the wine from this meal as new symbols, showing that his coming death would be a sacrifice that would redeem his people from slavery to sin and evil. After the meal, Jesus is arrested. He's put on trial before the Sanhedrin, a council of Jewish leaders. And they reject his claim to be the Messiah. They charge him with blasphemy against God. Then Jesus is brought before the Roman governor, Pilate. And he thinks Jesus is innocent. But he gives in to the pressure from the Jewish leaders, and he sentences Jesus to death by crucifixion. So Jesus is led away by Roman soldiers and crucified. Now, you'll notice right here in this section that just like Matthew did in the opening chapters, he increases the number of references to the Old Testament. He's trying to show that Jesus' death was not a tragedy or failure. Rather, it was the surprising fulfillment of all of the old prophetic promises. Jesus came as the servant Messiah, spoken of by Isaiah. He was rejected by his own people, but instead of judging them, he is judged on their behalf, bearing the consequences of their sin. So the crucifixion scene, it comes to a close, and Jesus' body is placed in a tomb. But the book ends with a surprising twist, the last chapter. The disciples, they discover on Sunday morning that Jesus' tomb is empty. And then, all of a sudden, people start seeing Jesus alive from the dead. And the book concludes with the risen Jesus giving a final teaching called the Great Commission. Jesus says that he is now the true king of the world. And so he sends his disciples out to all nations with the good news that Jesus is Lord, and that anyone can join his kingdom by being baptized and by following his teaching. And echoing all the way back to his name, Emmanuel, God with us, from chapter 1, Jesus' last words in the book to his disciples are, I will be with you. It's a promise of Jesus' presence until the day he finally returns. And that's the gospel according to Matthew.
Steve, you send me, Pastor Steve, the link.
Yep.
I will send it out in my email, which will be forthcoming today.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right there? Yes.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for attending Web. So anything you gleaned out of there that you maybe didn't think of before?
Well, that first part was fascinating. Thank you. Yes.
So the second part, I mean, basically, in Matthew's understanding of the world, there are two epochs or eras, okay? There is the time from creation to the birth of Jesus. And for Matthew, that is all the preparatory time so that when the Messiah arrives, he will be accepted. And now there's some debate in scholarship about, is there just one epoch afterwards, or are there two? Some would argue there's the time of Jesus, And now there's the time of the church, starting with the Great Commission. I tend to go with those who feel, no, there's the time from the birth of Jesus to his return is the second epoch. Sometimes we give the fancy term parousia, the return of Christ. All we know is that he is coming back. So in Matthew's understanding, I think really those are just the two ages that we're in. And now, even though he wasn't recognized at the birth, he was recognized eventually and will finally be recognized when he returns again. So 2 historical times for that. So this is another way of looking at the Gospel of Matthew. I just wanted to show you this because the greens are the teachings about Jesus. So even in this person's understanding, he would say there are 5 parts to the Gospel of Matthew. There's the beginning, the time in Capernaum, which I always used to get confused with Caesarea. I don't know why I did that, but Capernaum is on the northern end of the Sea of Galilee. And for most of that first half, that's where Jesus is based, in Capernaum, not in Caesarea, which is on the Mediterranean Sea. Then there is this traveling, because basically once Jesus is done at the north, he's now setting to Jerusalem. And so the main part of this, so half the book really deals with his time in Jerusalem, which says that he's dealing with the passion, the death, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And then there's a 5th part beginning again in Galilee, where he sends his disciples out to say, now you all go out and become ambassadors for Christ. So 2 parts of the gospel in this view. There's chapters 1 through 16 and then 17 to 28. In chapters 1 to 16, he's in the region of Galilee, and in Capernaum is his home. Basically 2 purposes, I think, in this first half of the gospel. Prove Jesus is the Messiah, and people of Israel have rejected him. Okay? Some highlights of this first section I think are important because, again, Matthew sets Jesus out as one he preached with authority. He isn't just like any of the prophets. He had authority. And so even in his hometown, where he gives his first sermon, which doesn't go over really that well, he says, and he taught as one who had authority. And again, when he upturns the temple and the money changers, as the cartoon showed, you know, he does it because he feels he has authority over the temple. He healed the sick and he hung out with sinners. Again, you know, this is proof that he asked Matthew to be one of his disciples. And that got him into trouble from the start, didn't it? That Jesus associated with people that the Pharisees would have never associated with. They're not our kind. Okay? He spoke in parables. So all of chapter 13 is a series of parables in the Gospel of Matthew. And again, I think it's important to remember that parables were stories. They were not, historical, events. But he teaches in stories, and the stories, in some ways, were meant to confuse people. He taught them in a way that would ask them, what does this mean? And so again, I think it's helpful for us as we read the scriptures at times, and we come to a difficult part, not to ignore it, but to ask, what does this mean? Why was it there? Why did Matthew include this? And then, what could it mean for our lives today? And then finally, Jesus calls for absolute surrender, not to the Romans, but to the power of God. The second part is an interesting part, 17 to 28. I like the term descent into greatness, because I think often we think about greatness as ascending, especially in political senses that, yeah, you can be a congressman, but a senator's better than a congressman. And then if you really want to go to the top, you become president of the United States. And so we assume that there's a hierarchy that you climb up to become great. And Jesus says, no, there's another way of being great. And that's by humbling yourself and becoming the servant of all. And so as the cartoon would talk about this reversal, this upside down kingdom, that the least will be the greatest and the great will be the least. Again, words that I think were so challenging to the authorities of that day. who prided themselves in having achieved a level of status that we are the leaders. We're the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes. And Jesus said, it doesn't work that way. And he lets his life be an example of that, ultimately culminating in his death on the cross. Yeah, I am the king. Back in chapter 1, we kind of got that established in the birth narrative. But now my throne is this tree called the cross. And so, again, interesting stuff. Valerie, how much time do I have?
You have about 5 more minutes.
5 more minutes, okay. So let me just ask you, so Matthew's writing his gospel, and I hope that as you read it, and as you have, like next week, Rabbi Ed and others, to allow yourself to hear the gospel a new way. And I really do like study Bibles, but I found in my own personal life that reading the NRSV version, which is what the Lutheran Church preaches on every Sunday, every time I read it, my critical mind kind of got in gear. And so either I was thinking, what does this really mean, and looking for a critical analysis of it, or being a preacher, how would I preach this text? And I found that I was having a difficult time in my own life in hearing the scriptures. And so I discovered Eugene Peterson's translation of the Bible, The Message. And so when I do devotional reading, I read the Message, because maybe it's just the way he wrote it, but it turns off that critical analysis in my brain, and I'm allowed to just hear it. And so, you can also be like a pastor and have a shelf of Bibles that you go to. But I would encourage you to find a way to allow the words to hear it. Lectio Divina is a wonderful way for that to happen, actually, as you contemplate, meditate on the words, that you allow them to seep into you. Questions, comments? Because I'm basically done.
Well, I have
Sure.
a comment I'd like to have you elaborate a little bit. I think the part that sort of stood out for me is the teaching of Jesus to his disciples, which I hadn't thought of quite like it was presented in this first video. I know that people back then had an oral tradition. I know about Homer, I know about all of this.
Yep.
But you don't think about that, as it said, they memorized what he said. And then that allowed Matthew and the other writers to present it to us. And I think, for me, it's sort of, this is a better awakening as to how we got this message. And you want to elaborate on that at all?
Well, just to remind you of what is considered the historical approach to the Gospels, we believe Mark was the first Gospel, probably written shortly after the temple had been destroyed in 70. And of course, that was a cathartic moment for the people of Israel, because the temple was gone, therefore God's presence was gone, therefore they couldn't sacrifice any longer. I mean, that was the purpose of the temple. You did not do sacrifice in synagogues. You heard the Torah read and discussed. You had to go to the temple. And so, what do we do now that the visual presence of God is no longer with us? And so, Mark already begins to pick that up a little bit. In Matthew's time, which we believe was written probably in the early 80s, so maybe about a decade after we get the Gospel of Mark. And we know that he has the Gospel of Mark because he quotes Mark verbatim at times. And then Matthew and Luke's written probably pretty much the same time. John comes later, okay. When you look at those Gospels, you can see where they copied from Mark, but there also seems to be another source that they're copying from about Jesus' sayings. And so the Greek word for sayings is quella, so we get this Q source. And so we believe that Matthew, the writer of Matthew, who probably wasn't the apostle, but is ascribed to the apostle, because if I want you to read a letter from me, I might encourage you more to read it if I have my bishop send it than if I send it, okay? And so I think, again, but whoever is the writer, it is ascribed to Matthew anyway, but he has this other source, and so does Luke. So we look at Matthew and Luke and say, all right, there's something similar, there's some things that are different. So the oral tradition, which was going on, obviously, for 70 years before we get the Gospels. I mean, the epistles are written earlier, okay? Paul's letters are written earlier. But Mark's first Gospel probably around 70. The letter to the Thessalonians, which we believe is the earliest letter of Paul, might have been written already 40 to 50. So you get the sense that that was happening first. So I think, the authority of the gospel, Mark's writing it, because now we believe at that point, up to a certain point, Christians were just fulfilled Jews. They continued to worship in the synagogue, and they were welcomed in the synagogue. And they were seen literally as simply Jews who took Jesus to be the Messiah. Well, somewhere around 60, maybe up to 70, the religious authorities began to get threatened by, wait a second, you're convincing people that Jesus is the Messiah. We don't believe he was. Why? The Romans are still here. Okay? If you want proof that you're not the Messiah, you didn't get rid of the Romans as far as they were concerned. And so at some point, and we've never been able to nail this down, basically Christians were asked to leave the synagogues. You are no longer welcome to worship in the synagogues. And so part of what Matthew is doing, I think, is responding to that rejection of the Jews, of the Christians. And so that's why sometimes his gospel is seen to have so much negative comment about the religious Pharisees. Does that help?
Yes.
All right.
And that also brings up a point. When the Romans attacked Christianity, or persecuted the Christians, I should say, did they persecute the Jews as well? Or were they after the Christians only?
Well, the easiest answer is that they were an occupying force.
Yeah.
And so the Jews always felt oppressed, that they were not allowed to live their lives totally the way they want. King Herod, of course, the Herod who was responsible partly for Jesus' death, he was put on the throne by Rome. And so there was this feeling that they were always oppressed. They had to pay taxes to Rome, that their religious life was controlled a little bit by Rome. I mean, it's good to remember, why does the army of come in on Palm Sunday? There's this wonderful image that Jesus comes in from the eastern side on a donkey and Pilate on his mighty horse. And he comes in on the western side. Why was Pilate there during the festival of the Passover?
To keep calm.
And why? Because what does the Passover celebrate?
Escape.
The liberation of Israel from the oppressors of Egypt. And, I don't think Rome wanted them to get this idea that you could do this again.
The big part of why Rome was there is they were very much in need of the resources that were in this area.
Exactly.
And so that's why they were a presence, and they were particularly picky about how they ruled.
Yep.